something that's, kind of bitchy.
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
It's just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Welcome to Bitchy History, the irreverent history podcast where one history professor gets to bitch about history and the impact it has on the world today. Hey everybody, I know it's been a minute, but I'm back. I've been burnt out both mentally and physically. The highs here in Phoenix are in the 110s at least every single day, and I just haven't been feeling like doing depressing research lately or recording episodes. Go figure. That said, today's episode is exactly that, depressing. But I do have some fun guest episodes coming up. I'll be traveling next month, and I'm planning to record another in-person episode, this time with my friend Alexandria, formerly AlexandriaArtifact on TikTok. We'll be talking about the history of women in STEM. I also am planning another episode with country music feminist icon Gwen Levy on the history of what I like to call murder country, aka country songs where women end their abusive and unfaithful husbands' lives rather than waiting for the police to deal with them, aka life without no-fault divorce. But now, on to today's episode. On May 1st, 4 child workers were found working on the kill floor at a poultry plant. A 16-year-old died at the same plant last summer after being pulled into a deboning machine. 3 of the 4 miners were working overnight shifts. What year do you think that's from? 1880? 1910? Of course not. Those would be sensible years for stories like that to exist. No, unfortunately, that's a story from this year. Before we get to how we've reached the point of miners working 11 o'clock shifts at the poultry plant, let's talk about the history of child labor in the United States in general. In the 19-teens, suffrage and labor activist Sarah Cleghorn wrote a poem titled The Golf Links. The golf links lie so near the mill that almost every day the laboring children could look out and see the men at play. Child labor dates back all the way to the beginning of America. The Open Data Project used data visualization and analysis to explore indentured servitude in Philadelphia from 1771 to 1773. In that particular data analysis, 17% of the recorded individuals were found to be children. Children were more often brought on as apprentices rather than simply indentured servants. They'd be trained in a variety of jobs. Boys tended to be trained as rope makers, carpenters, and tailors, while girls were usually trained in housewifery. Boys were more likely to be taught an employable skill, while girls were taught sewing and other feminine jobs, which is typical. That's an entirely different rant, though. One day I'll talk about pink-collar jobs and gender essentialism, but that's for a future episode. Trust that it will be coming up eventually, though. The data that they analyzed showed that the longest terms of indentured servitude from a child during this era were actually 2 siblings, Anna Marie and Adam Schendifer. They served 18 and 19 years, respectively, in indentured servitude. Adam was 2 years old, and Anne Marie was 4 years old when their father signed them into service. Maybe he had a good reason to send his toddlers away to be servants, but even if he did, it speaks to how acceptable child labor and servitude were in the American colonies. Poor, illegitimate, orphaned, abandoned, or abused children were often placed in pauper apprenticeships, where they were raised to adulthood in a legal condition of indentured servitude. While this sounds incredibly inhumane to our modern ears, you have to understand that there were no real systems of social services set up to care for children without families, resources, or advocates at the time. This was as close an option to foster care as there really was. And this kind of system would be common in America, Canada, and Great Britain for many years. Consider that Anne of Green Gables was set in the 1880s, and the entire setting for this story starts with Marilla Cuthbert telling Rachel Lynde that Matthew went to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia, and he's coming on the train tonight. From the 19-teens all the way up to the 1970s, Britain had a child migrant program that sent 7,000 children between the ages of 3 and 14 to Australia. They were promised families and a better life. What they got was not the happy ending of Anne of Green Gables, nor was that the end most pauper children and indentured servants received. Lucy Maud Montgomery was serving us the most whitewashed of stories when it came to Anne and her adventures in Avonlea. People like Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert were not the norm, though I suppose that there are enough horror stories from modern foster care to let us know that Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert still aren't the norm for people who take in children with nowhere else to go. But what about children with families? Surely they didn't put their kids to work while they were still toddling about and learning their ABCs. Actually, they absolutely did. America in the late 1700s and early 1800s was overwhelmingly rural, and our economy was agricultural. Farmers put their own children to work young, again, keeping the chores and farm tasks usually split along gender lines. Girls took care of the household and helped with the younger children. Boys helped with the farm work and eventually would be apprenticed to a craftsman to learn a trade if they were not the one to inherit the farm themselves. By the 19th century, the reality of work in America had changed drastically, especially in the North, which had taken to industrialization like a duck to water. Those pauper apprentices went from serving as apprentices with artisans and instead went to work in factories. But it wasn't just orphans working in the factories. Women and children composed around 40% of the entire manufacturing labor force during the initial period of industrialization. In the U.S., textile mills were a main component of industrialization in the northern states. They hired whole families in the early 19th century. By the late 19th century, industrialization was in full swing in most of the country. The South wouldn't really begin to fully embrace industrialization until the Second World War for reasons that we are all aware of, even if Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis don't like admitting it. I suppose here is a good place to put a little caveat about this episode. I am intentionally not handling the issue of enslaved children in the antebellum period in this particular episode. That's an entirely separate discussion, one which I don't really think is in my lane, so to speak, and also one that probably deserves its entire own episode. But back to the Gilded Age. By 1880, 5 million Americans were engaged in manufacturing, construction, and transportation jobs rather than in agriculture. Most factory workers were working 10-hour days, 6 days a week. And children were no different from the adults. At least 1.7 million children under 16 years of age were employed in factory and field work. 10% of all girls aged 10 to 15 and 20% of boys of the same age were employed. In 1900, 18% of all American workers were under the age of 16. Children worked long, grueling hours. They also faced threats posed by high-powered machinery. One reason for hiring them was due to their size, making them easier to fit between and inside machines to do work or repairs. Those of you screaming about how dangerous it is to get inside of a factory machine have a point. The employers, however, did not care. After all, they were also paying the children lower wages than the adults, and there was always more poor orphaned kids to hire if one of them got crushed on the factory floor. Imagine kids, some as young as 7, slogging through 12-hour shifts for barely $1 a day. They weren't just risking paper cuts. They were getting seriously hurt, losing fingers, limbs, and sometimes even their lives. And if that wasn't enough, many ended up with tuberculosis or nasty respiratory diseases from the filthy conditions that they worked in. Why would anyone let this happen? Because their families needed every penny just to keep going. The working class was stuck, choosing between a rock and a hard place, and their kids paid the price. One of the most well-known labor tragedies of the time took place in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. In that one fire, 146 factory workers died, and of those, 36 were minors between the ages of 11 and 17. The average age of all of those who died was 21. Throughout the 1880s and up into the early 1900s, many attempts at passing reforms and laws to ban child labor took place. You can find all sorts of interesting articles in the archives, either denouncing or supporting these reforms. In one 1883 article in the New York Times, the brief notation on a labor bill in Wisconsin, which prevented the hiring of children under 14 years of age, was spoken of in negative terms, because it would see 3,000 children unemployed throughout the state. I love that their problem with this isn't that 3,000 children in the state of Wisconsin were employed by cigar manufacturers, but that those children would now be out of work. In New Jersey that same year, an article says that after a labor law was passed, there were many applications made by parents, and sometimes children themselves, to allow children under the age of 12 to work in the New Jersey silk mills. Again, in New Jersey, they said that if this law is enforced, 3,000 children will be unemployed and many will be out on the streets or in the poorhouse. Which again, seems to be missing the actual problem at hand, but go back and listen to my episode on the impact of Puritanism on American culture for my thoughts on how poorly we take care of our most vulnerable citizens here in America. General B.F. Butler wrote in 1884 that as long as children were getting some education, it would be a terrible idea to pass laws preventing them from working in the textile mills. He writes, Their work may be the only support of a crippled father or mother, or of their still more helpless brothers and sisters, and in a properly constructed and ventilated mill, it is not unhealthy for a child to work not too many hours a day. The labor of the children of the family might be the very means of keeping the family together, so that the child would be brought up under proper influences, instead of being thrown upon the world or sent to an almshouse or some reformatory institution, which is the very worst place in the world to send them, in my judgment, for, as a rule, institutionalized children are of no use for themselves or their country. It will not serve as much of a surprise to my listeners to learn that General Benjamin Franklin Butler owned shares in the Lowell's Middlesex Mill Company in Massachusetts. How many hours did he think were not too many hours a day, you might ask? Well, I can't tell you exactly what he thought was appropriate for children, but he did institute a 10-hour workday, which, to be fair, was a shorter workday than many of the other mills had at that time, I guess. Anyway, he might have been a little bit biased on this issue. Also, if the best a country can do for a crippled father or mother is to put their 11-year-old to work in a textile mill to support them, that might be a sign that there are problems in your country, right? Especially since that crippled father or mother was likely crippled in a factory job of their own. After all, factory work was dangerous. By 1900, there were around 35,000 deaths and 500,000 injuries in factories every year, and only about 2% of those injured, or the family of those killed, ever recovered on claims against those employers. However, the sheer amount of column inches dedicated to this topic in the New York Times and other newspapers indicates that people were starting to pay attention. And while many articles like this one in 1907 titled "Southern Mill Men Angry Over Inquiry, Think Federal Bureau is Helping New England in its Child Labor Investigations," because yes, dear listener, just as the South had foamed at the mouth about Northern abolitionists wanting to take away their slave labor before the Civil War, the South was now extremely dedicated to keeping their cheap child labor as well, and pushing back against Northern child labor reform groups like Jane Addams' Hull House. However, it is clear that this uproar was only happening because of attempts to reform the laws and restrict child labor. Many reformers, many of them women like Jane Addams, spoke out against the evils of child labor at this time. By the start of the 20th century, efforts for reform had become widespread. In 1904, the National Child Labor Committee was formed, dedicated to abolition of all child labor. At this point, state-level laws restricting child labor were in place, but these laws saw a lot of resistance and not much enforcement. Frequently, child labor law opponents denied any problem existed and aggressively extolled the virtues of children in the workplace, despite the publicity of photos taken by people like Lewis Hine, which highlighted the poor conditions in which children were working and the health risks caused by that labor. Many child laborers were underweight. Some suffered from stunted growth and curvature of the spine. They developed diseases related to their work environments, such as tuberculosis and bronchitis for those who worked in coal mines or cotton mills. Since state-level laws didn't seem to be working, child labor reformers began to look toward a federal law. In 1916, they had their first success, although it didn't last long. Congress passed something called the Keating-Owens Act. This act established the following child labor standards: a minimum age of 14 for workers in manufacturing and 16 for workers in mining, a maximum workday of 8 hours, a prohibition of night work for workers under the age of 16, and a documented proof of age that was needed by employers. The law was declared unconstitutional in 1918 by the Supreme Court in the case Hammer v. Dagenhart because it overstepped the purposes of the government's powers to regulate interstate commerce. Because of this, an attempt was made in 1924 to add a constitutional amendment that would give Congress the power to regulate child labor. The amendment would give power to Congress to limit, regulate, and prohibit the labor of persons under 18 years of age. Ratification was stalled in the 1920s by a campaign to discredit it by manufacturers and the first Red Scare. We would not see a federal restriction on child labor passed successfully until the era of the New Deal, under which the Federal Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938. This was once again challenged in court, but the Supreme Court upheld its constitutionality in a case in 1941. The bill provided for a 40-cent an hour minimum wage, a 40-hour maximum work week, and a minimum working age of 16, except in certain industries outside of mining and manufacturing. Outside of mining and manufacturing is an important caveat, which we will come back to in a bit, believe me. But back to the conflict over child labor. You'd think it ended in 1941 when the Supreme Court declared the Federal Labor Standards Act constitutional, but given what I shared at the start of this episode, I bet you know that's wrong. Certain folks have been fighting against child labor laws since the first time we put them in place. In 1980, David Koch ran for vice president on the Libertarian ticket and promised to abolish child labor laws, along with abolishing Medicare and an end to all corporate and personal income taxes. And in 1982, under President Reagan, the Department of Labor made major changes to child labor laws, expanding the hours that a 14 and 15-year-old could work and allowing employers to pay students only 85% of minimum wage. Organizations like the Cato Institute, Foundation for Economic Education, and the Commonwealth Foundation, all funded by the Koch brothers, by the way, have produced numerous reports arguing the value of increased child labor and eliminating the minimum wage for children, arguing in one case that depriving work opportunities to poor children in developing countries only limits their options further and throws them into worse alternatives. There has been a major push in the last few years to loosen these labor restrictions. Since 2021, there have been 28 states that have introduced legislation to weaken child labor laws. So far, only 12 have actually passed them. They've lowered the age at which children can work in certain jobs, expanded the number of hours they can work, including allowing them to work during normal school hours in some cases, and shielding businesses from civil liability for work-related injuries, illness, or death sustained by minors that they employ. That shielding is important, since according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 57 children 15 years and younger, as well as 68 teens aged 16 to 17, died from injuries sustained at work between 2018 and 2022. Among other types of work, young employees are now found in manufacturing facilities and meat processing plants, where the work might entail using toxic chemicals to clean the blood and other remains off the slaughterhouse floor. We're seeing 12-year-old roofers in Florida and Tennessee, 14-year-old construction workers who aren't attending school, 15-year-olds working the night shift packaging up Cheerios. But as sad as all this is, the really sad thing is that child labor never actually ended in the United States. According to a report from 1997, child labor accounted for 20,000 workers' compensation claims, 200,000 injuries, and thousands of cases of permanent disability and more than 70 deaths each year. How is that possible if we passed child labor laws 60 years before that in the 1930s? Well, remember what I said about the Federal Labor Standards Act making jobs outside of mining and manufacturing exempt from their rules? That's important because at that time, more than 60% of child workers were employed in agriculture, which was unregulated by any of the laws meant to restrict child labor. One major reason for this was that many reformers only saw child labor as bad in the context of factories and mines. Farming was good, honest American work. Activist Alexander McKelway wrote in 1905 that open-air farm work was beneficial in developing a strong physical constitution. The argument was usually also that most children were working on their family farms and the harvesting season didn't interfere with their school schedule, which might have been true at the time, but with the rise of industrialized farming in America, that wouldn't remain the case for long. In the U.S. today, 4 companies produce 81% of cows, 73% of 57% of pigs, and 50% of chickens. In the 1930s, 24% of the American population worked in agriculture. By 2002, that percentage had reduced to 1.5%. Large farms control nearly 2/3 of all U.S. agricultural land and account for 42% of all agricultural sales. And that's okay. Or at the very least, it's a topic for an entirely different podcast, because I know nothing but the most basic pros and cons related to industrial agriculture. Industries change to fit the needs of a population. The problem is that the laws never changed with the industry. These industrial farms are not just family farms where the children of the owners are assigned chores and help plant and bring the harvest in. They're massive corporations, and if there's one thing we have learned from the 19th century, it's that corporations will use whatever legal loophole they can find to increase their profits by decreasing the amount they need to pay. Here I quote the U.S. Child Farm Workers' Dangerous Lives petition from Human Rights Watch. Child farm workers as young as 12 years old often work for hire for 10 or more hours a day, 5 to 7 days a week. Some start working part-time at age 6 or 7. Children, like many adult farm workers, typically earn far less than minimum wage, and their pay is often further cut because employers underreport hours and force them to spend their own money on tools, gloves, and drinking water that their employers should provide by law. Children risk pesticide poisoning, serious injury, and heat illness. They suffer fatalities at more than 4 times the rate of children working in other jobs. Some work without even the most basic protective gear, including shoes or gloves. Many told Human Rights Watch that their employers did not provide drinking water, hand-washing facilities, or toilets. Girls and women in these jobs are exceptionally vulnerable to sexual abuse. As a result of their long working hours, children who do agricultural work drop out of school at 4 times the national rate. So the real question is, why is this only becoming a story that hits the national news cycle now? Estimates by the Association of Farm Worker Opportunity Programs suggest that there are approximately 500,000 child farm workers in the United States. And while groups like Human Rights Watch and many others have been talking about this for a long time, the issue of child labor has really only become a major story in the last few years. Why? Well, I hate to say it, but most of these children are migrant workers, just as their parents are. Conveniently, these individuals have few people to advocate for them and no real way to fight back against abusive practices by their employers. After all, as long as we can get our organic tomatoes and quinoa, who the fuck cares about the age of the person picking it? At least that seems to have been the prevailing opinion for a very long time in America. I hate to speculate, but I have a strong suspicion that we've only started to pay attention now because the children dying in sawmills and slaughterhouses today are now occasionally white. Not always, but the outcry of "not the children" always seems to wait until the children in question are paler than average. Better late than never, I suppose, but the progressive era seems a whole hell of a lot less progressive when we realize how many major loopholes they left to allow the abuse and exploitation of minors. And somehow, instead of improving the situation, we're letting ourselves slide right back to the Gilded Age. Groups like the Heritage Foundation, with their Project 2025, want to turn us back to pre-1938 standards if they have their way. I'm not kidding. Page 596 of the Mandate for Leadership, which is Project 2025, says, "Some young adults show an interest in inherently dangerous jobs. Current rules forbid many young people, even if their family is running the business, from working in such jobs. This results in worker shortages in dangerous fields and often discourages otherwise interested young workers from trying the more dangerous job. With parental consent and proper training, certain young adults should be allowed to learn and work in more dangerous occupations." That sounds suspiciously like General B.F. Butler there. Will it take another Triangle Shirtwaist Fire to fix things again, or can we agree that a 16-year-old being killed in a deboning machine is probably an unacceptable way to deal with poverty in this country, and that putting minors into hazardous jobs is not the way to deal with employee shortages, and not the way forward for our country in the 21st century? Thank you for tuning in to hear me bitch about history. If you're loving the show, don't forget to subscribe and make sure to visit bitchyhistory.com to sign up for the newsletter. The newsletter offers extra resources on the topics covered in all of our episodes, as well as on the topics covered in my videos on TikTok. Supporting the podcast is really easy. Spread the word to your friends, grab some fabulous Bitchy History merch off our website, or consider becoming a paid subscriber. Your support means the world to us.
History.
History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?